right. Well, hey, I am so pumped that you're joining us right now for this webinar. We're talking about discipling Gen Z on the Kairos Network Life of Church Planner webinar series. And I'm so excited because you are sitting with two of my favorite people. Dr. Jake Youmans. I think every DC intern I've ever trained, I found at Austin. So that's where I first met you. And I've just always enjoyed our conversations, whether it's life or ministry. And you especially have an incredible pulse on the next generation coming up. And then I had the privilege of meeting Heath recently, who also trains DCEs. Jake does in Concordia in Austin. And Heath, you do it out in Minneapolis, right?
St. Paul, yep.
St. Paul. And Heath was telling me about his doctoral dissertation on Gen Z. And I was like, this is a conversation nobody is having and we need to have, because otherwise it's going to turn into the millennial conversation where it's like, hey, the millennials are out there. They're making a ton of money now. They have kids. Let's figure out how to get them in church. What if we just kind of, start the conversation a little bit earlier than that? So guys, thanks a bunch for being willing to join us and share in this time.
Absolutely.
So I want to let you guys know, we'll have Q&A. So if you have questions, go ahead, drop that into the Q&A. We'll respond to that. We've got some questions too we'll walk through. And then of course, if these guys mention some links, I'll do the best I can to throw them in the chat for you. But don't worry, we will have a follow-up PDF with video that's got everything for you. So we're really looking forward to this. But just to kick it off, what is Gen Z?
That is the question. Good. So anytime you do, or anytime I've done a conversation on the generations, my first one was on Gen X in the 1900s. It's important up front to state that generational science isn't a real science. It's a whole lot more observational, and probably the most interesting part of the conversation is the start date of each generation is going to be a little bit different depending upon what you read or who you listen to. So as far as where Gen Z starts, I've seen everything from 95 to 2001. And Heath, I know that you've got a couple of different thoughts on that. Two quick things for me is the idea of generations used to be one generation produces the next generation, produces the next generation. The fun thing I'm learning right now is I have two Gen Z experiments at home, a 17-year-old and a 15-and-a-half-year-old, is that when I go to parent conferences and meet my kids' friends' parents, I'm not the old guy. There are boomers that have Gen Z kids. I'm not the young guy. There are millennials that have Gen Z kids. I was born in 75 and pretty much the heart of Gen X, and I've got Gen Z kids. So that's become a little bit more confusing.
Yeah, it's really interesting you say that, because in the Northeast, we see that a lot, like people waiting longer to have kids. So, you'll have people in their young 20s that have kids and people in their, late 30s, early 40s having them. So yeah, you see it across the board. So that's a really interesting observation. Would you narrow it down any more than that, Heath?
So I wouldn't narrow it more than that. I think that those are kind of spot on with what a lot of sociologists would say as far as start dates. Jake, you're right. No exact science here. Strauss and Howe, and I won't nerd out on this too far, but they have a great system that they use as far as trying to narrow it down and identify, but even that's not an exact science. You can see anywhere for a generation from 15 to 20 years is about the average span. But what we're really looking for, usually you're going to see three common characteristics that kind of outline or define what a generation is. And we're talking about the similar location in history. So your 90-year-old is not the same as your 10-year-old, right? Similar age group, born around the same time. Two is that they espouse similar values or beliefs. And we see that kind of work through the generations and we'll talk about the beliefs and some of the attributes of Gen Z today. I think we're going to get into some of that. And then lastly is there is some level of identification, right? And you'll hear people say things like, well, in my generation, or that sort of stuff, where they kind of know these are my people. These are my folks over here that I connect with and I understand. Now, for me, I think Gen Z personally, if I was going to put a marker with it, not as many folks on the 2001 end, but for me, it's a 9/11 start is a solid time to start it. It's the most clear, definitive marker that we have where the world really shifted at that point. And so But you can get into a lot of debates about why that is or is not a great marker. And we don't have time for a long debate on that today. But like Jake said, it can go anywhere. Pew, I think, uses 97 as a start date. Barner uses 99. I'm saying 2001. Jake, I don't know if you have a preference.
I like to hop around depending upon what fits my context.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad you guys brought this up because, when we're sharing out the webinar and stuff, oftentimes people are like, well, why are we having a conversation about Gen Z? I mean, it's just word and sacrament ministry, right? Let's just get them in church and reach them. Why do we need to have this conversation? And I think, Heath, you hit it, is each generation has different things in the atmosphere that have shaped them, different core ideas about culture or media or, people's place in the world. And so I think if we don't take time, I feel like this is a great time to almost step back and listen a little bit to who Gen Z is.
Amen. And I would add to that, one of the most important paradoxes in parenting is helping parents understand that, yes, you were their age once, but you were never their age now.
Yes.
And go ahead and share back when I was your age stories. Those can be powerful and connecting and help to build bridges. But we also need to understand and listen, as you said, that you were never their age now. And then now is really the conversation of why study Gen Z.
That's right. Those experiences are so different. Like they're totally different. We live in a very different world. I tell my students all the time, it wasn't that long ago that I was in high school. Okay, it's been a while. But it hasn't been that long. But it's totally different for our high schoolers today than it was even when I was back 20 years ago when I was finishing up high school. It's a totally different world, and the things that y'all deal with on a daily basis, it's not the same.
Yeah, if you want a good picture of that, watch the first 21 Jump Street remake movie, and they show the picture of the guys in high school in the 90s, and then trying to come in the early millennium, and yeah, it's hilarious. That's recommended watching for you. We'll pop a link in there. But as we talk about this, you guys mentioned there's actually a really big challenge that's been a recent challenge when you're trying to look at generational research for Gen Z specifically. What is that challenge?
Take that, Jake?
Me to go first. So I took a sabbatical 2 years ago to really dig into Gen Z research and the latest thoughts and trends with Gen Z. And then I don't know how much everybody knows, but about 6 months ago, the world changed with the COVID-19 coronavirus. And I've looked over some of the research these last couple of days, prepping and preparing for this. And it is fascinating how much things have changed in just these last 6 months. Tim Elmore has used two terms that I think are going to be interesting to see if or how they stick in defining Gen Z. One of them is the coronials, and obviously that's funny because it rhymes with millennial. And another one is the Zoomers, and there's so many fun levels of that because number one, you get the Z piece in there. You also get the virtual online Zoom education existence in there, and perhaps most importantly, it rhymes with boomer.
Here's my thing to jump off that, Jake. Coronavirus has changed the game in the way that we talk about generations, but I think we're going to get into some stuff. I've been thinking about this a lot over the last few days. I don't know that we're going to see a major shift in Gen Z. I think that coronavirus is actually maybe positioning itself to draw out some of the attributes that are already present in Gen Z. Right, fear and anxiety, stress, pragmatism. That's this is going to only extend and further those attributes that are already there. I'm wondering personally, are we on the verge of another generational shift? Are we looking at the start of another generational shift? Mark McCrindle says that actually started a few years ago. He says 2010 we started to see Generation Alpha emerge, and so I think this may be more than saying how does it change Zers. This may be a conversation that says, are we on the verge of a new generation emerging?
I think that's really interesting that you say that, because if you take 2001 as the generational marker for Gen Z, these kids were 9/11 babies. And now those 9/11 babies who have now graduated high school were COVID graduates. So they didn't have normal graduations. They didn't have the prom experience. They're now, a lot of them are going off to college. and they're finding out the quote unquote college experience that their parents, built up for years. Like, you got to have the college experience. It's some of it's virtual, some of it's on a campus, some of it's really locked down on a campus. I mean, you guys are on campuses, so you realize that. But you talk about the high anxiety and stress. You could see how that would be elevated in a time like this.
So perhaps the most defining word of Gen Z pre-COVID was FOMO, the fear of missing out. If you've read anything about Gen Z, you've heard the word FOMO. What was interesting is the moment the lockdown and quarantine started, there was nothing to miss out on. That's also why you saw the incredible rise of things like TikTok, because they had to create their entertainment. They had to create their interactions in that way. So one thing I've been really processing, and again, with my personal Gen Z experiments at home, and also the students God bless you with at Concordia, when there's nothing to miss out on, do you still experience FOMO? And then talking to a group of students yesterday, I asked them that question, and they said when the quarantine first hit, they really noticed a change in themselves. They weren't missing out on anything, but then summer hit, and their friends started doing different things, going to camp or maybe traveling for the first time or those kind of things. And they felt a greater anxiety than they had before COVID started in this FOMO idea. The other, by the way, fear of missing out, when you look at the seniors, the current college freshmen who were seniors last year, whenever I get to talk to my freshmen, I love to remind them that 50, 60 years from now, when the PBS documentary on the coronavirus is made, they're going to be the ones interviewed about all the things that they lost during this time. But if you think about the fear of missing out, I mean, that group missed graduation, prom, spring formals, all that kind of stuff, but they missed it together. So it became this uniting missing, which is, again, just fascinating.
Yeah, that's interesting. So what are some of those? So fear of missing out is one defining thing. What are some of those other defining characteristics that you would say characterize Gen Z?
If I can go into, Tim Elmore calls it the 3 F words of Gen Z, and these are rather fun. Fear of missing out, like I said, fear of being offline, or let me find that here. How's he word it? FOBO, fear of being offline. According to research done with Raising Leaders, 70% of Gen Z fears being offline and views it less of an addiction and more of a way of life. And then the final F word there is FOMO, fear of messing up. Fear of messing up. And they don't know how to risk, is what some of the research suggests.
Wow. So, that's really interesting because, I'm what you would classify a grandpa millennial, 1981, oldest of the millennials, right in that gap year, Gen Z millennial. And so we were, quote unquote, the trophy generation, right? Everybody got a trophy, that kind of thing. And so now you're saying it's kind of swung more the other direction. And now we're afraid we're not measuring up. We have this fear that, we're going to fail in what we try versus being told, hey, whatever you did was great.
And again, one of the dangers of this kind of conversation is to go into stereotypes or to set up a specific example as true for everything and everybody. But it's no coincidence that you had the college admissions scandal with this generation, because they could not get in on their own. So they found other ways to get into these elite universities.
So is this one of the first, because I've heard the term and I love the term. There was the term helicopter parent. And then there's the new term, which is snowplow parent, which is literally the parent that paves the way.
Those of us who don't know what snowplows are, the metaphor I use is a bulldozer parent, but exact same metaphor. And please, the difference between helicopter and bulldozer is so different. Helicopter, it just observes everything, but the bulldozer clears the path so there is no obstacle.
It's really interesting. So before we dive in, because what I'm super interested to talk to you guys about is how does the understanding of Gen Z and what we're learning about Gen Z then translate into us being able to disciple this generation and help them grow up or get connected to the faith for the first time? Because you obviously have a higher population that are disconnected from the faith than I think even in generations previous, if the numbers are continuing to track. But everybody thinks they know maybe a lot about millennials, what are the key differences you feel like, or the areas where people maybe mistype some millennial attributes to Gen Z?
So I don't know that I would say that these are maybe mistyped, but first, I think we have to talk about diversity as well. This is the most diverse generation in history, and that's racial and ethnic. 48% of Zers are people of color. The fastest growing demographic is multiracial. So this is, and we're seeing some of that play out, right? It's not just that they think diversity is good. Like previous generations might have said, like, diversity is good. We embrace diversity. We like diversity. It's an expectation for Gen Z, right? And that bleeds over then into their organizations that they're a part of. That bleeds over into the church. They expect to see diversity in all aspects of their lives. And when they don't see it, they may be a little bit skeptical. They may start to question that. That bleeds over into gender identity and sexuality, where that is a big topic. This is a group that grew up with the 2015 Supreme Court decision on same-sex marriage. So this has been an expectation of the United States anyway, where the ones that we're talking to a lot are living. That there's equality here and this kind of thing. Identity and individual expression, they're going to work to make sure that people can express themselves freely. And so for them, diversity is not just the word, it's also about equity and inclusion, right? So that's a big deal. The technology is a big deal. I think one of the big things that we're seeing with technology is that they're expressing themselves more in images. The attention span is shorter. And like Jake said, they've grown up with it to the point that it's not just a thing that, like, we like technology. They're really the first digital natives. They're the ones who've had it around for their whole lives. 95% have internet at home. 90% say they would be reluctant to ever sever that connection because they see it as a piece that goes out into their other world. And then safety and security. This is a group that is looking for physical safety. They've grown up in the specter of war. They've always faced these physical threats and they've seen that stuff. They're also looking at financial security because they've grown up in recessions and times of financial struggle. They've watched their parents and their siblings deal with that and what that looks like. And so they're very pragmatic. They're very realistic in the way that they approach things, including financial decisions. And consequently, they are hardworking. We talked about the snowplow parents or the bulldozer parents. Jake, I like that. But this is also a piece where I don't want people to think like, well, Gen Z is just another generation that's not willing to work for things. Because they've seen those things, they're very willing to work for it, and they are hardworking, and they'll do what it takes to achieve what they need to achieve. Jake, you like to throw around the word entrepreneurial with that.
Yeah, so Pew Research says that it's the most entrepreneurial generation yet. 72%, according to Pew Research, want to someday start their own business. And what's interesting, I look at, again, my little Gen Z experiments at home. By the age of 15, they'd started 4 different businesses. And what they realize is all you need to start a business is a business card. And there are companies that will give you 300 business cards in the mail. You can start a business for free.
It's, it's amazing that you put it that way because, it's the most diverse and the most connected, highly entrepreneurial, hardworking, pragmatic. And so how do you see that translating to faith? Because I think a lot of people even think of the video stuff that we're doing as like, oh, okay, this is just a COVID thing. And when COVID's over, I'm going back, I'm throwing it all out. Other people are realizing, no, this is something that's here to stay in ministry. What aspects of how we do ministry do you think are going to be important for connecting with Gen Z?
So 2 quick things there. Like I just said, the entrepreneur idea. The thing an entrepreneur needs the most is a problem to solve. So I would encourage any pastor, DCE, teacher, anybody out there working with Gen Z, admit lovingly your problems to them and turn them loose. See what kind of creative ideas they can come up with. And it's interesting you mentioned live streaming, because I've talked to a number of churches recently where their entire live stream is being done by a couple of kids in the youth group. And I love that model and that idea. Give them a problem and let them just kind of run with it and see what happens.
Yeah, so I would second that. I think as an LCMS Lutheran, I would say that, like, our theology is really well set up to minister to this generation. Like,
Amen.
With our emphasis on vocation and the idea that our callings are all important and that where God has placed us, we can serve and we can do his work in those areas with the priesthood of all believers. I just think we're set up well for that entrepreneurial spirit to help encourage those things and draw them out, and to help not just give a problem to solve, but to recognize gifts and talents and passions, and to say, I don't have all those gifts. Help me overcome that. I just think there's a lot there that we can work through with our young adults if we're willing to really uphold those core principles of Lutheran theology.
Well, and I know that's especially on the entrepreneurial end, it's a bit of a tension, because in the churches I grew up in, it was like, when you hit your 30s, we've got a spot for you to serve, but this is a generation, it sounds like, that they need a place to work that out in their faith. They need a place to serve. They need a place to be a part of what's going on, and not just simply like sit in the pew till you're ready.
So, Jack Welch in the 80s was the first, I believe, to coin the term reverse mentoring, and you've seen that taken off in a couple of different ideas. What I'm really curious about, and I say this cautiously, but I'm really curious about, is if we can comprehend the idea of reverse discipleship, that these students who we are in our charge and we are discipling, can we also be discipled by them? Can we allow them to kind of drive the agenda on some of these conversations? I think it'll be interesting to process that.
Yeah. So I'll throw in a shameless plug here for my dissertation work. So Matt, you mentioned that earlier, and with my dissertation, I'm studying Gen Z and their relationship with clergy and the experiences they've had with clergy in the LCMS. And one of the first things we talk about is their history with the church. And almost to a person in these interviews, they have used language such as the LCMS or the church in general is not built for our age group, right? I don't feel like there's a strong place for young adults in our church, which is heartbreaking. Also a great opportunity for us to say, well, what can we do then? How can we do this? So your conversation is very timely for me, because that's what I'm hearing. I spent basically all of August interviewing young adults across the LCMS about their experiences with the church. And almost to a person, I heard the LCMS just isn't built for us. There's not really a place for us here.
And what are some, because you spent the summer like really talking to them across the country. So what are some, that's kind of the overview, but what are some tangible examples of that? Some things that we can really put our hands around?
So I shared with Jake yesterday that this was the most interesting thing, that this came up several times through the interviews that I've done with the young adults. They loved, in reflection on their time in the church, they loved confirmation. Now, to a person, they almost said, I would have never said that when I was a middle schooler. Okay? I would have never said that I loved confirmation. But what they've found now is that was the time in their church experience where they had the ear of their pastor on a consistent basis. That consistently, week after week, their pastor showed up, not just for the whole congregation and not just for the general worship service, but for them. He was there for those students. And it was the time, to Jake's point, this one was really interesting that you brought up the idea of reverse discipleship, Jake. This was the one time in their church history where they really felt like they got to help drive the agenda of what was being talked about. That when they had a question, they knew their pastor would be there that week and would answer it. Now, certainly that's probably not true in every congregation. Not all of us deal as well with questions as others. But for these students, they said, I knew I could go to confirmation on Wednesday. My pastor would be there. And when I had that question, he would answer it. They also said basically that once confirmation was done, and for most of us, that's in 8th grade, right? Where we do the rite of confirmation, they lost that. What I shared with Jake when we were chatting about this earlier this week was, think about what that equates to. It was the time that I felt like I had a voice where I could ask my question. And then I lost that because I didn't have that consistent time to talk with my pastor, to ask those questions and that sort of stuff. So they felt like they lost that voice. Well, what happens when you lose your voice in any organization? You're probably not going to stick around too long.
Yeah.
And that's what happens with a lot of our young adults or our young people. When they feel like they lose that voice, when they feel like there's not that place for them, that's when we start to see the attrition.
Wow. So you guys being two people that train DCEs, that send people out a lot into kids ministry, youth ministry, outreach kind of stuff. What are some suggestions you would give to a pastor, a youth worker who is hearing this, like, because honestly, when I thought confirmation, I thought kids did it because they had to, they hated it because it was more classroom time. You're saying from the research, they liked that because of the ear and the voice. What would you do to transition to see less of an attrition after that?
You want to try that, Jake, or do you want me to go?
Go first, yeah, 'cause I'll hop in.
Okay. So for me, what they're saying too is that they loved it when the pastors would come to stuff after confirmation, right? Come to youth group, come to even once in a while, teach a Bible class for us, do those devotions. They loved personalization and individualization, if you will. So they love when, even now as college students, and I'm working with 18 to 23-year-olds for my research. First off, just because it's easier than working with minors in research. Like, let's be really honest about that. But the other hope is that we can say they're on the upper end of the Gen Z spectrum. So if we can get them, if we can learn lessons from them now, we can maybe make some changes for the younger part of Gen Z. So what they're saying is now, like, I'm in college and my pastor is sometimes sending me an email saying, hey, I thought of you. I know you're studying this and I read this week and it made me think of you and I wanted to share it and know that I want you to know I'm praying for you. So they love that kind of stuff. We're sending the pastor sending them a text message, things like that. They want, again, their pastors to come to things. One of the things they're saying too is I love it when my pastor is able to use his sermon, and I'm drawing out the theme here. They didn't use this language, but as relational development. For a lot of them, on the young adult side of Gen Z, whether they are going to college or whether they're starting a job and moving out of mom and dad's house, it's a very transient time, right? There's a lot of change. There's a lot of shifting. And so for them, what they're saying is, I just need to know you're there with me. I need to know that you're going to reach out to me, that you're going to be there, you're going to connect with me, all that sort of stuff, right? So I want consistency. I want to know that you're sticking with me even through those transient times. And I want you to use the sermon as relational development. If I don't know you or if I'm going to a new church, I want the pastor to be able to say, hey, this is a little bit about me because I don't know you. So there's a lot there that they've shared. And I'll share a little bit more, but I want to hear Jake's thoughts.
Yeah, a couple of quick things is that it ties back into the difference between millennials and Gen Z. According to the research, millennials' top value is community. And from a young adult workforce perspective, it's this idea that they value community over career and place over paycheck. So they will take a lower paying job that maybe isn't their dream job if it's the right community, geography, those kind of things. And then for Gen Z, it's that individual one-on-one time. I'll tell you this, one assignment that I changed a couple of years ago is all of my freshmen now, and this can be very time consuming. Pastors, DCEs, teachers, I know this is very, very time consuming. I make each of them sign up the first semester they're at Concordia for a 30-minute walk around campus with me. And they meet in my office and I have a set loop that we do. We wander around campus. The first half, I drill them with questions. Second half, they drill me with questions. And they get to meet my people on the walk. I meet their people on the walk. But it has been a crucial time for me to get to know these students on that individual one-on-one basis.
I'm going to totally steal that, by the way.
Steal it, by all means.
So I'll follow that up because that does connect with some of the other stuff that I have on my cheat sheet here, right? So the last question I ask, I do 3 interviews with each participant. The last question I ask is if you were to sit in front of a room full of pastors and tell them something about how to reach your generation, what are you going to tell them? Y'all, here's the deal. Like,
good stuff.
Here's the thing. I think for me, like when I think of like whenever I start a research project, I kind of want it to be like landmark, groundbreaking, big deal stuff. This is not that, okay? The stuff I'm hearing isn't probably going to shock anybody, but that's awesome news. It's bad news for me because it just means it's not what I thought. But it's great news for the church because it means that a good relationship with Gen Z and good ministry to Gen Z is totally within our reach. They're not asking for things that are going to cost a lot of money or take a lot of facilities or even take a ton of time. Y'all, they're literally saying things like, be nice to us, talk to us, try and understand our situation, connect with us outside of worship. They want pastors and church leaders to take the first step in building that relationship because in a lot of ways, like I said, young adulthood especially is a transient time for these people. And they're saying like, I need somebody to show that care and that concern and be willing to take the first step. Listen to us. that's easy stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
not always easy, right? But it's simple enough that we can do it, and it's not going to take a lot of resources. So again, I think for me that's encouraging because we can do that as leaders in the church. We can do that stuff.
One thing I'm always going to encourage pastors to think about is asking questions and asking open-ended, creative questions of their students. One of the things that how do I want to say this? The sitcom idea of the kids have a problem and the adult solves it has crept into the church in a lot of ways, where in youth group or whatever, it becomes this wise old person telling them how to live life or how life is supposed to work. Flip that. Pastors, DCEs, teachers, ask them questions and listen to what they have to say. Let them be the experts.
Really quickly, I'll jump in on that. I think it was 2011. I was at Exponential Conference, and Michael Frost, I think, was the one who said this quote. It's stuck with me since. Listen to your people. They're telling you how to serve them. Yeah. Right? If you listen to your people, they're telling you how to serve. We're not saying change word and sacrament ministry. That's the foundation of everything we want to do with our young adults. But man, like, listen to their concerns, listen to their cares, listen to their needs, and that will tell you what word they need to hear today. Like, that will help you bring the gospel to them. That will help you share Christ with these young people if you are willing to listen and understand where they're at and who they are and what they need.
So Michael Frost is one of my heroes. I love his stuff, and he tells the story of the Olympics in Sydney, 2000 Olympics in Sydney, that the evangelism group that did the Olympics in Atlanta in '96 came to Sydney to hear about how to reach out to Australian culture. And they sat in his office for 2 days learning all about Australians and Australian culture. And at the end of those 2 days, they brought out the exact same brochures they used 4 years ago in Atlanta. And Michael Frost, in his cool Australian way, threw him out of his office and said, "You guys didn't listen to a thing that I said." Really think, how can we listen and then implement what they are talking about?
Yeah, that's huge. And I think Haley asked a great question. Haley, thanks for throwing a question out here. Understanding that importance for that one-on-one connection and trying to be in a spot where you can listen. She says, look, how do we do the walk about with minors? Like, in a world where there is a lot more scrutiny around that, and at the same standpoint, we've got to have these, one-on-one connections. How do you do the logistics?
So for me, I think there's, I always tell our students a few things. First off, there's value to public places and public spaces, right? If you can, and that's difficult right now, obviously, right? But if you can find those public spaces, that's really helpful. You can make that sort of thing happen. Two is, I would say that it doesn't always have to be the walk around. I shared with Jake an example yesterday that I'm super introverted. And I'm the stereotypical shy introvert. Not all introverts are shy. I'm the stereotypical shy introvert. And so I had to find ways in ministry in the parish to leverage that. And so after a long weekend of worship and education programs and youth programs and then staff meetings on Monday mornings, I was drained. And so I would lock the door to my office. And one of the things that re-energizes me and recharges me is writing. And so I would find a way to leverage that by handwriting notes to probably 10 to 15 people every Monday afternoon. That recharged me as an introvert. It allowed me to give something to somebody that hopefully at that point was of value to them, where they're able to see my appreciation, know that I'm praying for them, and initiate that relationship development. So it doesn't always have to be the walk around, right? But it does need to be something where you are taking the step to initiate the relational development. We can't expect Gen Z to say, yeah, of course, I'll initiate the relationship development, especially with a church leader. Sometimes they aren't given the message that, hey, we are approachable, or your pastor is an approachable person. You can go talk to your pastor. So for us, it's important to just find a way to take that first step. That was one that worked for me. It doesn't always have to be the Jake Youmans walk around.
I love that idea. I just want to echo that with this, is that Walt Mueller from the Center for Parent and Youth Understanding talks about how as our world becomes more digital, becoming analog is going to be important. again, that's just that reverse of what the world has to offer. Letter writing, I think, is a really cool way. What if you did get a pen pal type relationship going back and forth, or have them a journal back and forth or something? It doesn't necessarily have to be in person, especially because of the reality of our world right now. I think the key in whatever it is, whatever your personality type, whatever your situation is, how can they hear you and you hear them in that one-on-one type relationship?
Well,
And
and
know
I
that
think
you
it's
care. And know that you care. That's the biggest thing. I think that if I was to interview your students, Jake, after they did that walk around with you, I would think that that would probably be something that would come up. Like, he took an interest in me. He asked me questions. He did those things. And so that's the biggest thing, I think, is finding a way to show that you care and you are there for them.
And if I can, and Matt, I apologize because this is a soapbox issue that Heath and I have talked about many times in the last 6 months.
Those are the best ones.
I understand I will probably get hate mail for this, but let me say it very boldly and see what God does. DCEs, youth ministers, pastors, please stop relying solely on YouTube videos and Zoom meetings. We've got to find more creative ways to engage our people. From a youth ministry perspective, and Matt, you've already kind of hit on this, youth ministry will die if it feels like school. And when school has all gone that digital route, where it's all Zoom meeting instructional time, if the church is just going to be doing YouTube videos and Zoom meetings, we've lost it. We've lost it. And I recognize fully that you taking the time to send a postcard to a kid, it's not going to go viral, and you're not going to become a famous children's minister for your clever content and your wacky insights. But we've got to think beyond the YouTube videos and the Zoom meetings. I know that's been a little bit overdone, but my kids, especially those first 3 months of quarantine, probably did a different birthday parade every week, because it was that desire for that contact, even in a time of quarantine. We've got to rethink how we engage in this time.
Yeah, I think that is huge, huge advice, because I think too, like, I'm not going to say digital's easy, because obviously, everybody learned in a weekend, how much goes into it. But I think the better we get at it, we realize there's an efficiency to it.
Sure.
We just can't always default to the efficiency.
Sure.
And to Heath's point, I love the way you both have summarized this. It's just incredible. It's, they want to be listened to. And on top of that, they want a personal connection. So what I would tell you is figure out how you, in your personality, your wiring, can do that well. Like, Heath is describing the cards, and all I think is my cards would look like hate mail, because my handwriting is so bad. I wrote cards to all our volunteers one time, and they said, "Man, we really appreciate the typed out message that you give." But, and I resonate with Jay. I'm like, but man, I would meet somebody at the church and I would do a walk around Ridgewood and we would just have a blast. So I would just encourage you, figure out with your cultural constraints, what they're asking for is simple. Now figure out how you can do it.
Amen. Amen.
What are maybe some of the bigger structural things that we need to relook at as we quote unquote do church? Because right now we're at a point where everybody's churches structurally have been ripped down to the studs. And so you have the opportunity to either rebuild it the way it was, or rebuild something that's maybe better equipped to reach this new culture and generation. So what are some things we should look at, even on a larger system level, that might need to change?
I guess probably the most important thing to say when this kind of question comes up is, if anybody tells you they have it all figured out and have all the answers on how to do church in and post COVID, defriend them. They are lovingly, they are hopefully loving you. They are completely lying to you. I'll make it personal. Kind of tell you what's been really powerful for my family and I is we've started to double our bubble and expand our people group and that kind of stuff. Post-quarantine time. We're not necessarily comfortable to go back into the sanctuary and sing and worship in that sense, but we've been having a couple of families over the house to watch church together online. And it is amazing the difference. Having just one or two other families in your living room with you, it's amazing the difference that makes over just being by yourself with your family. It means rethinking that community into a small-ish model first, the people directly around you. Again, I love the phrase double your bubble as you think about the next couple steps in a COVID response. But perhaps the church then resources those home churches or those small groups in that way, eventually trying to build back up to what it would be like to regather as a larger body of Christ.
I think that's a great point. I do think you should check with the bubble gum companies to make sure you're not infringing on any trademarks.
Excellent. Thank you.
Might be. But I think the other thing that goes along with that, Jake, is that as we've been forced in some ways to look smaller and more into ourselves, Gen Z has this massive global perspective, right? Again, we've talked about the diversity, we've talked about the technology where they can see beyond their own doors and their own neighborhoods even. I think for the church, we have to start really being far more intentional than many congregations are about looking beyond just the doors of our own congregations. I think that's going to be something that this generation wants and needs. And they know when that's not happening because, again, technology has allowed it. The relationships they have with people of other cultures and ethnicities and just all the diversity they experience, they know when that's not happening, and they are really seeking something that's going to make an impact beyond just the doors of their own congregation.
If I can be so bold to speak directly to pastors, preachers, that crowd right now, I've talked to a number over the years who talked about the training they received where they were told to study and prepare 1 hour for every minute that they speak. And while I certainly respect that, whenever I get the opportunity to speak into that, I always challenge them to think it from the lens of mission and outreach. What if you lived missionally 1 hour per minute that you were going to speak? And my hunch is the sermon would write itself. Matt, I've seen you do this. I've done it with you as we wander around Ridgewood and experience the community and meet random people or servers at restaurants or all those kind of things. What if we, again, flip that script as opposed to studying by ourselves in our office with no other input but wonderful scholars and wonderful books? What if we went out and lived missionally and just watched how that worked in our hearts to eventually lead to our preaching and teaching?
Oh, that is huge advice. I hope you guys are taking that down because really what it begins to do is it reshapes your language. And I think if you're pulling anything from this, I know the biggest takeaway I'm going to have is when we talk about reaching a new generation, it's not rocket science. It's basic stuff that you learned in seminary. You're just applying a specific way. And when you get out in the community and you apply some of those basic things, you start to learn the language people are speaking and you're able to translate the gospel into that language. And that's powerful. Yeah.
And if I can be so bold, there's a book called The Art and Science of Learning to Love Where You Live. Matt and I have had this conversation many times offline. But in there, it's from a sociological perspective. And she actually moved from Austin, Texas to West Virginia. God bless her. And realized she didn't love where she lived anymore and wanted to scientifically figure out why she didn't love where she lived and what she could do to learn to love where she lived. And she found 3 key things to learning to love where you live. And as followers of Jesus, I think this applies not only to the sociological phenomenon of loving where you live, but also the actual loving where you live, loving the people in the place that you live. Number 1 is walk. When you walk, endorphins are released and you tend to fall in love with the surroundings. You also get to meet people and notice things that you would not notice. A fantastic study was done with 3rd graders comparing those who drove to school and those who walked to school. And they asked them to draw a picture of their neighborhood, night and day, between those who walked to school and those who drove to school in the detail, in the ability to articulate what their neighborhood was like. Powerful idea of just walking around. Number 2 is get to know your neighbors. I strongly encourage you, if you don't know the businesses, the people who live around you, now might be the best time ever to socially distance and find out how you can serve them and meet their needs at this time. And the 3rd thing is to buy local. I know there's some amazing big box stores. And I actually, when I'm done with this, I have to go to Costco. So I love the big box stores. However, When you do your off-campus meetings, when you go to restaurants, what if you really focus on buying local and building those kinds of local relationships in the community? Those are ideas that she found sociologically to love where you live.
It's been huge. Those were huge for me when I first moved out to New Jersey as well. You're going to pack on a few if you buy local here, because there's a lot of bagels and pizza, but it's worth it.
Don't forget about the pizza.
Yeah. So we've got, I love this question, anonymous attendee. Anonymous attendee always sends in good questions. But it says what are any tips on how to teach this to the rest of a congregation, how to eliminate the us and them mentality and see that we are all one church?
I'm gonna let you tackle that first.
Well, and this is not going to shock either of you or those online who know me. You've got to model it first. As the leader, as the pastor, DCE teacher, whatever it may be, you have got to model it first. One of the frustrations I think everywhere is leaders who do not model what they say they believe. So if you really want to get out there, it's got to become a priority for you in your schedule, and you've got to model it.
Yeah, I was going to say it's got to be shown. I understand that sometimes that's hard, especially when we start talking about the young adult cohort of Gen Z, right? Because again, they're not always present. Storytelling becomes a huge deal, right? Storytelling can be a part of your modeling. Because again, how do you practice presence with people who aren't physically present? That becomes a problem. That becomes a challenge. So again, telling the stories of, hey, so I had lunch with this group of our college students this week, or, whatever that looks like, or I heard from one of our college students, and those kind of things where, without divulging any confidences too far, how can you tell the story of how you're engaging with them when people can't see it physically? It's hard. And then again, for me, it's just consistently showing up and inviting others to come along with you to consistently show up. You as a pastor can say, hey, Jake, I need you to come with me to this thing. I need some help with this youth event, or I'm doing this thing for the youth group. I need you to come help me pick up some stuff from Costco, because I know that Jake is going there afterwards. All that kind of stuff, right? So bringing other people along with you, using your stories to share, and like Jake said, modeling it as well as you can.
Well, and real quick on that, Heath, I would just echo even stronger. Pastors, leaders, if your people don't know your story, now's a great time to start. How did you come to faith? How did you get a call in the ministry? Do they know your story? So my favorite research was done in Germany a couple of years ago on the power of storytelling and brain research. And what they did is they hooked up MRI machines to storytellers and story listeners. And what they found out is that a good storyteller can get the story listener's brain to light up in the exact same spots there are. So here's what they really determined. The best way to put an idea into someone's head is not facts and figures, it's telling a story. It's not necessarily doctrine and theology, it's telling them a story. But how fun is it that modern German brain research coincides with Jesus' funny habit of telling parables? And if I can if I can go into some of my shameless plug for some of my past research, my dissertation was on movies as the vernacular of adolescence. This idea of pop culture being that connecting story for them. How can we take the stories that they know and that they tell and connect it back to the gospel?
Yeah,
it's huge.
So I would argue really quickly, let me jump in, Jake, and you'll like this, Matt. Will Mancini has some good resources on that piece too. His vision casting spider diagram, I think, does a great job of helping share where you can and how you can tell that story effectively, to basically say, how did we all collectively get here? What are the needs we have right now? How do we know that? And what can we do to move forward with that? I think there's some great resources there that help tell that story.
That's really good. I love, man, all the stuff coming in. We're getting some good questions in here. So Mark Kessling asked, balancing the traditional understanding that entrepreneurship is risky and that Gen Z has FOMO and desires security, how do your Gen Z students deal with failure, especially if parents have shielded their kids from failure? Are your Gen Z students so well equipped, connected, smart, etc., they fail less than previous generations? Or where can the church step into this conversation? And where are mental health what are the mental health issues? And obviously the gospel's key, but what else would you suggest?
Yeah, I would say first, the mental health thing is a big deal. And we kind of touched on that. I wrote down some stats from, I believe most of them are from Barna, but right, 3 in 10 struggle with anxiety, 39% of college students experience depression and anxiety, 11% have had suicidal ideation, 24% are receiving some sort of psychotherapy, right? So that's huge. And that definitely plays into the idea of fear of failure. This is also where I think we're uniquely positioned as the church, and not to just fall back to the old way that says, well, just preach the gospel. I do think that preaching the gospel, though, here is important, to know that there's grace when we do fail, and to know that, I forget who originally said it, right? That failure is not fatal, right? That, and how do we, again, how do we model that? How do we walk alongside of our young adults? I think that's where that consistent presence with the entrepreneurial mindset of our young people is super beneficial. Jake and I had a conversation this week where we said, like, are our students the only ones that we think mess up sometimes? Like, does anybody else have stories like this? So I hope that's okay that I say that much, yeah. Jake. But and we shared some about, right, where our students aren't any better equipped than the rest of this generation. But I think the difference is how they get mentored and how they see failure modeled. Right? If they never see the pastor make a mistake, if they never know the pastor has screwed up or messed up, Excellent. If they never know those things, then that just builds the anxiety and the stress that I cannot fail. And then I'm not as willing to take a risk. But if they have somebody walking alongside of them, I tell people all the time, delegation is actually just as hard, if not harder, than true delegation than doing it yourself. Because you have to walk alongside of the person, you're going to coach the person. You might have to clean up some messes with them along the way, but that's how they learn. That's how they get through it. And that's what we need to be doing. Unfortunately, we don't always do that in the church.
So 2 quick thoughts from Tim Elmore in the idea of fear of messing up with Gen Z. He encourages us to make sure we teach excellence versus perfection. Mm-hmm. Teach excellence versus perfection, and then praise variables that are out of their control. Praise variables that are out of their control. A quick personal example from my daughters, and one of the other things that differentiates between millennials and Gen Z is the driver's license and the car phenomenon. During the reign of the millennials, we saw Uber and Lyft explode and become some of the biggest companies in the world. And let me tell you right now, from very personal experience, if you want to get your driver's license in Texas, all the appointments are booked up for months. Some of my kids' friends have had to travel hours, a couple of hours away to get an appointment at the DMV to get their driver's license because the DMV has not been able to predict just how excited Gen Z is going to be to get their driver's license. One of the most defining moments of my daughter's life in driving and independence so far was we told her, we'll take you to get your license the day you turn 16, but you have to do all the work. You have to get all the paperwork assembled. I'll pay for it. I'm still dad. I'll take care of that. But you have to get all the paperwork assembled and do all the talking to the DMV employee. And you all know how much fun it is to talk to DMV employees. She did it. On her birthday, we get down there and she presents all the paperwork and it is nearly perfect. She forgot one thing. It is nearly perfect. And the DMV employee looks at her, and again, I'm like 4 or 5 feet behind her. She's doing all the talking. The DMV employee looks at her and says, "Young lady, did you do this all yourself?" And she has one of these big, beautiful smiles. "Yes, sir." And he says, "Young lady, most adults can't get this all right."
That's awesome. Oh, man. Huge, huge. That's cool. I love that. So we've got 3 questions that have come in that I think are 3 great ones to cap the talk off on. Really good. First one, this is from Joshua Gierkin. Are you seeing any differences in the generation with youth living in cities versus rural areas, Midwest or coast, living in the Midwest? Are there things you have said are my youth and others seem light years off?
Context. And that, again, hopefully you all got at the very beginning of this, we talked about this not being a good science. It is so much about context. Hopefully, though, it gave you some thoughts to think through on maybe some different ways to approach and reach out to them. Socioeconomic, race, there are so many different factors that come into play in addition to the ones that Josh mentioned. But what I would still argue is the key is listen. The key is listen.
Well, and that is a really great question though too that I throw out to you guys because it is the most connected generation in
Mhm.
history.
Mhm.
So, do you find that there's more commonalities amongst those different, so like it used to be, in the past it was a radically different upbringing if you were in the rural farm town coming up, kind of country boy, versus like in the middle of the city. But now the rural farm boy and the person in the middle of the city have access to a lot of the same formative content, should we say.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
do you think you're seeing more overlap, or do you think it's too early to tell?
So that's the fun paradox of modern times is there's more connectivity, but also more options.
Mm.
So when we were kids, you had three, maybe four TV channels. Kids don't even know what TV channels are nowadays. To be honest with you, there's just so many more options. By the way, with Gen Z, and I love this stat, when you ask Gen Z kids what is the top job they want someday, YouTuber. YouTuber number one, by far, by the way, by far. What does that tell you? Is that they want to be famous, and there's that whole piece we can get into later if we want to or have time, but also reminds you of how many options there are out there. Just unlimited options. So find that connecting cultural piece, be it movies, TV shows, songs, whatever, is actually more challenging now than ever because of the content and the options.
So we'll have to invite our youth into the new YouTube studio that we're building. That'll be our
Yes.
connection point there. No, I love what you're talking about because it's funny. I have kids. I've got 7, 5, and 3. And one time I played a show on a TV show that had commercials, and they said, "Dad, why'd you shut off our show?" I was like, "That's a commercial.
Yes.
We used to have to watch these all the time, and you couldn't fast forward." Yeah.
Dude,
so I get that.
The week my oldest was born, we got TiVo for the first time. So she's never known life without being able to stop, pause when you want to snack, go to the bathroom, whatever, until we went to grandma's house. Grandma didn't have TiVo, and that was rough to explain how that all worked.
You guys are going to love this one. Speaking of knowing our leader's story, any advice for a brand new DCE who got their first call right as COVID and quarantine hit? That's where I'm at. There's so many people I haven't even met yet because of how thrown things are and have been shut down. So trying to build those relationships from the ground up with so little contact is tricky.
I would jump back to some of the stuff we talked about earlier. I know that the phone is not people's favorite friend right now, but get on the phone, make phone calls, write cards and letters, do what you can to be the one who initiates in your context. For me, the thing, again, I'll go back to the fact that I own the fact that I'm super introverted and shy, but the letter for me was a strong tool in ministry because not only did it help give me that boost that I needed as an introvert, but it also initiated conversation and it was something tangible that people could hold on to. And so in this time where, again, like Jake said, everything is digital, everything's about Zoom meetings or whatever that looks like, hop on the phone, make a phone call, even if it's just to say, hey, we haven't had the chance to meet yet, but I'm the new DCE at your church. And I just want to know how I can pray for you this week. Right. And I'm really looking forward to meeting you. Or get a hand cramp, start writing letters, man. Like just get on the stick there and start sending letters to folks. That's kind of a lost thing too, right? But people still love getting real mail that's not a bill.
Yeah.
So whatever you can do to initiate that relational development, people aren't, what you're going to experience. My guess would be that people aren't going to start calling you and saying, hey, I know you're the new DCE at the church. I want to get to know you. Some might, but the vast majority won't. They're going to expect on some level that you as the leader in the congregation are going to take that step and take the initiative to make that first contact. So I would say if you can't go meet face-to-face or do the Jake Youmans walk around, if you can do that.
Yeah.
Or if you can find a safe way to do that, be outside where you can get a little bit of distance or get on the phone, start handwriting some letters, do whatever you can to initiate that contact.
I think the big picture thing I would encourage you to think through, I've told a couple of my interns this, and thank you for your questions. Every new church worker, I believe, is wrestling with this, and the old ones are too. We're just not as honest about admitting our mistakes or we don't know. But I really think during this time, focus on depth versus width. How can you do little large? how can you, maybe it's 2, 3, 4, 5 youth, whatever that you really invest in right now, but take those relationships and, as God allows, spread those out. But really focus on depth over width.
That's huge. Katie, amazing question. Thanks for asking. Last question comes in from Mitchell. It says, in a time like this where youth ministries are forced to look different than they've ever looked with Zoom calls and videos, what are some other ways we can engage our students? So we've talked about like the really personal one-on-one phone calls, letter writing. Are there any other ideas you'd have or things that you've seen other people doing to try and engage their youth?
I think Josh Gherkin, who I think is on the call and asked a question for us earlier, I think he did a great job with that early in the pandemic. He started doing this voices, I think is what he called it. I forget what he called it, voices of the gospel or something like that, where he had folks from his congregation sharing short videos and devotional videos so that they could encourage one another and share a favorite Bible verse or just a prayer for the group and that sort of thing. So not only was he reaching out saying, can you do this? He was then allowing folks in the ministry there and beyond to have a voice in the conversation and connect with one another. So he was using his platform to connect with students to show that they had value, voice, and worth in the church. But then he was also allowing them to do something that builds up others and connects other people too. So I thought that was a great idea and a great model for how some folks might be able to use technology in a very different way to connect people.
A couple quick thoughts. Number one, I still encourage you to think about in person in the safest way possible, whatever that looks like, wherever you're at, following local CDC guidelines to the best of your possible ability. And again, maybe think small. Maybe right now where we're at, it's got to be less than 10. In other places, I know it's different, but I really encourage you to think, how can we get back to that face-to-face, whatever that looks like. The buzzwords right now in all education are synchronous versus asynchronous. And I don't really know what those mean yet. Something about, I don't know what they mean. It's about whether we're live or we're not live type idea. And I think too often the church really focuses on the idea of synchronous all at the same time on that Zoom meeting or whatever. But what if we took a page from some of the corporate folks and thought about maybe contests or what's the Instagram thing where they're putting up, you have to pick 3 from this category and 3 from this category and 3 from this category to find the perfect desert island thing. Maybe we think about the idea of asynchronous and how can we be connected in that way, in those kind of fun, just engaging kind of things.
Great ideas. I mean, Jake, Heath, it's been phenomenal. And I really appreciate you guys taking the time to just dig into this because, a lot of the stuff you're talking about, sometimes it's just nice to know that, hey, we're not talking about incredibly complex things that you have to be this, super pastor or super DCE to figure out. It's really simple. And I think the next step is to just try something. So that's what I want to tell you guys. If you're on this, if you're getting a little frustrated with COVID and the challenges it brings with ministry and how every ministry book you own is no longer worth anything, you just want to burn them all. My challenge to you today is Jake and Heath have given you really simple things. Try something. Try one thing this week that's maybe a little bit different and just do a gospel experiment. See what happens. It'll be the best thing ever. I want to thank you guys so much. If you guys want, we're going to send you a follow-up PDF. If you want to share that out, feel free to share it out with anybody. Jake and Heath both shared some amazing links with me for resources to help you understand Gen Z better, as well as their contacts so you can reach out to them and connect more. And I want to thank you guys for taking time to be on our webinar today. So thanks a bunch.
Thank you.
Awesome. Hey guys, really appreciate it. Not just us yet, but I stopped the recording. So it won't be permanent.
Interests me. It always interests me that whenever you get a generational conversation, eventually it morphs into the bigger picture of what is ministry. I always find that so fascinating.
I love it.
Yeah, I shared with Jake yesterday, some of the questions that were coming in before as it was being promoted were how is this generation different? And I think that it really does come down to some of the stuff that you mentioned, like try new things. And we've got the resources that we're going to send out. And I think that's important, right? Jesus talked about the idea that, like, I know my sheep know me. Well, this is about knowing your sheep, and then you can minister effectively. And I think that's going to be a big deal for us as we move forward, right?
Oh, that's all. No, it's huge.
But so much doesn't change.
It's absolutely huge. No, this is awesome.
Now's the best time to make change. So all I have to do is say,